Between 1930 and 1960, 98% of all loans were given to only white families. This excluded an entire generation of black people from home ownership opportunities. Now today, we're going to be talking about redlining. What is redlining? Redlining is the systemic denial of financial and other services to residents of a specific area, usually based on race. Why do they call it redlining? Well, it was actually a physical map that had red lines on it to keep people out of specific communities. Mainly it was used for banks. The federal government created maps that color-coded neighborhoods based on their perceived financial risk. Areas predominantly inhabited by black people, immigrants, and other minorities were marked in red. Hence the name redlining, signifying dangerous investments. These maps influence the practice of banks and lenders systemically denying mortgages and insurance to residents in redline neighborhoods. Now, why are we talking about this today? It's 2024. Shouldn't we be over this? Redlining continues to affect communities by perpetuating wealth gaps, housing inequality, and educational disparities. By denying home ownership opportunities to minority families for decades, redlining prevented wealth accumulation through property ownership, leaving a lasting racial wealth gap. Today, formerly redlined neighborhoods often have lower property values and limited access to affordable housing, contributing to ongoing economic instability for residents that live there. These areas frequently face underfunded schools as property taxes from public education exacerbate educational inequalities. The legacy of redlining also influences systemic issues like limited access to credit, gentrification, and environmental disparities, making it a persistent barrier to equity for marginalized communities. That's why we're talking about it, because the things that happened in the past affect the people that are living today. Now, how did redlining start? What are its origins? Well, we have to go back to the 1930s. The U.S. government had a program. It was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was established in 1933 as part of FDR's New Deal to combat the widespread housing crisis during the Great Depression. Its primary purpose was to refinance home mortgages that were in default, helping homeowners avoid foreclosure. The HOLC introduced long-term fixed-rate loans that were more affordable for struggling families. However, as a part of its operation, the HOLC created residential security maps to assess the risk of lending in different neighborhoods. HOLC used a color-coded grading system to evaluate home desirability and neighborhood desirability for mortgage lending, reflecting the racial and socioeconomic biases of the era. Neighborhoods were graded on a scale from A to D, with each grade corresponding to color. A was considered the most desirable. It was also called the green zone. Typically, affluent white and suburban neighborhoods were in this category. B were still desirable, but slightly less exclusive, often middle-class white areas. B were still desirable. The B was often blue. Still desirable, but slightly less exclusive, often middle-class and white areas. C, those were yellow neighborhoods. Declining neighborhoods, often older and more industrial with a mix of working-class residents. And then D were considered hazardous neighborhoods. These neighborhoods often had significant black, immigrant, and low-income populations. Areas that were red were the ones that were red line. That's where the word literally comes from. And those were the areas, like I mentioned before, that were desirable or segregated for black and low-income families and immigrant families as well. Those areas, the red-lined areas, were systemically denied access to mortgage and investments, as lenders used these maps to justify discrimination. The red designation reinforced racial segregation and economic disparities, channeling resources to predominantly white areas while neglecting minority neighborhoods. This practice institutionalized inequality and had lasting effects on urban development and wealth distribution. Now, we try to act like it was just the banks and the lenders that were involved with this level of discrimination, but the federal government played a role in this as well, specifically through Fair Housing Act and the VA loan program. Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration played significant roles in institutionalizing redlining through discriminatory lending practices. The FHA, established in 1934, ensured private mortgages, making home ownership more accessible. However, it explicitly refused to insure loans in or near neighborhoods with significant Black and minority populations, citing these areas as financial risk based on HOLC maps. These effectively excluded minority families and from accessing the same home ownership opportunities as families. Similarly, the VA created the After World War II to support returning veterans, offered low-interest home loans with no down payments. While these benefits were intended to help all veterans, similarly, the VA created after World War II to support returning veterans offered low-interest home loans with no down payments. While these benefits were intended to help all veterans, discriminatory practices in local lending institutions and real estate agencies meant that Black veterans were often denied these loans or steered towards segregated neighborhoods. These policies concentrated wealth-building opportunities in white communities while reinforcing racial segregation and housing inequality, deepening the racial wealth gap that persists today. There were a ton of policies that made this even worse and even entrenched segregation after Jim Crow and during Jim Crow. There were a ton of policies that entrenched segregation into the mindset of Americans and codified it in the law at the time. Redlining policies entrenched segregation by systemically directing resources, investment, and opportunities to predominantly white neighborhoods while marginalizing minority communities. Through tools like the HOLC, maps, and discriminatory lending practices by the FHA, minority neighborhoods were labeled as high risk, making it nearly impossible for residents to secure home loans or insurance. This forced Black and immigrant families to live in segregated areas with limited access to quality housing and public services. Zoning laws and racially restricted covenants further expounded segregation by legally barring minorities from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods. As white families benefited from rising property values and generational wealth through home ownership, minority neighborhoods faced disinvestment, declining infrastructure, and limited economic mobility. These redlining policies created and reinforced a racial divide in housing that persists today, as formerly redlining areas remain under-resourced and segregated. Some of the examples of cities that were redlined were Chicago, Illinois. Redlining was widespread in neighborhoods like the South Side and West Side, contributing to severe segregation and disinvestment in Black and immigrant communities. These areas saw limited access to mortgage loans and were often left vulnerable to urban decay. Detroit, Michigan. The city's Black neighborhoods, including areas like Black Bottom, were heavily redlined, leading to long-term economic disinvestment and the decline of the city's urban core after the mid-20th century. New York City. Neighborhoods in Harlem, the Bronx, and parts of Brooklyn were redlined, with Black and Latino residents often denied mortgages. These solidified racial segregation and created stark wealth disparities. Los Angeles, California. Redlining in areas like South Central and Boyle Heights compounded racial segregation in the city. These communities faced disinvestment in housing. These communities faced underinvestment in housing, schools, and infrastructure. San Francisco, California. Areas like Oakland and Richmond experienced redlining, restricting Black and immigrant families from home ownership opportunities and contributed to long-lasting racial wealth gaps. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. South and West Philadelphia, home to significant Black populations, were designated as hazardous areas in the HOLC map, resulting in decades of disinvestment and property damage and poverty. Atlanta, Georgia. In Atlanta, neighborhoods like Vine City and Old Fourth Ward were subject to redlining practices, contributing to racial segregation and economic disparities that persist today. Washington, D.C. Redlining in D.C. affected predominantly Black neighborhoods, exacerbating housing inequality and contributing to the city's racial and economic divides. Baltimore, Maryland. Many of Baltimore's black communities, such as the West and East Baltimore areas, were redlined, leaving them with limited access to home loans and financial resources. New Orleans, Louisiana. Areas like the Treme neighborhood were redlined, perpetuating segregation and limiting access to resources for African American residents. We're saying all of this, and we live in 2024, so what does this mean for today? How does redlining affect us today in America, meat and potatoes, where we live in the land of opportunity, and everybody seems to be making millions of dollars, but some people aren't? The first thing we need to do is realize this. Redlining prevented home ownership and generational wealth accumulation for minority families by systemically denying them access to mortgages and other financial services. This means is that even if you wanted to own a house, you couldn't because the system was stacked against you. Today, white families in America have 85% of all wealth when it comes to home ownership wealth. This also when it comes to how much money you have, this is a big. According to data from the Federal Reserve, white families control 85% of all this country's wealth, while black families only comprise 2%, while representing about 13% of the population. Now, this trickles down into services that we use for our children and for our daily lives. A lot of states, public education is funded through housing income tax. In a lot of states, education is funded through property tax. If you live somewhere where your school is not funded properly because people don't own homes, your school is funded less. It also trickles down to things like environmental racism. Redline neighborhoods were subject to air and water pollution. Hazardous waste, and toxic chemicals, leading to a range of health issues such as asthma, lead poisoning, and cancer. In cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, low-income neighborhoods marked for redlining often became the home for heavy industries like steel mills, refineries, and chemical plants. And those are just some of the effects today. Some of what we see is gentrification. Cities gentrify. Historically, redlined neighborhoods are increasingly targets for redevelopment, which often lead to displacement of long-time, low-income residents, many of which are Black or Latino. Gentrification tends to drive up housing costs, push out the very communities that were previously denied investment. Developers and real estate investors often capitalize on these areas after they've been neglected for decades, transforming them into more desirable and expensive places to live. While this can bring new amenities, it also exacerbates inequalities, leaving displaced residents without affordable housing options and further deepening the racial wealth gap. It's important that we know the history, and it's important how we know how to go forward in the future. In order to combat things like this, we can support fair housing policies, learn about local history, or even give money to organizations that fight housing discrimination. The lines that divide us decades ago are gone, legally, on paper. But when it comes to the effects of the things that happened decades ago, they're still here with us today. It's important to understand them so that we can start the healing process and move forward. Hope you learned something new today. Like, subscribe, and share. And I appreciate you all for watching. Thank you.